So maybe if you can say about a few words about the language adaptation of your platforms.
Okay. Our main language is Hebrew, but we have some of our platforms in English, some of them or most of them in Arabic, some of them in Amharic, and
Russian.
and some other language if there is a need. So we are dealing with languages. We are dealing also with the left to right or right to left problem of languages in websites. It's a big problem, and also with languages. Yeah.
No. I mean, it's also a problem of cultural problem, because there's not a simple translation. Once you translate even from Hebrew to English or from Hebrew to Arabic, some terms don't exist, or some terms have to be adapted to the culture of the actual language, and that is a really great challenge for us.
Excellent. The next question that came up is that given that there's a lot of personal data uploaded into the various systems, how do you safeguard the data in terms of data protection mechanisms which are in place?
Oh, it's a technical questions. I can't get to in it because I have no time, but really we have a unit in our e-government unit, very strong unit that their mission is to defend us, as you can say. They are checking us from the time we are starting to build every infrastructure. They are part of our teams, and they check us before we are going, we upload to the air. It is a part of our every doing is cyber. It's not after, or it's from the beginning.
Excellent. Another question that came up is, do these platforms have any feedback mechanism, or how can users rate their experience of each of the service or platforms, and especially, as you adapted and build new infrastructure in a short amount of time, how did you deal with the user feedback mechanism?
In most of the platform, we have a mechanism that a citizen can write if what was his what you have to say to us. But really, I don't see that most of the citizens do it. I don't know what is your user experience, but most of the users don't like to write after they did the service. They want to go home. They don't want to stay and write to the government what they think of it. We do it in other ways, as we take we're doing checkings with companies that are especially know how to check user experience and customer experience. This is the best way that we find to do these things.
Excellent. So I think that we'll maybe leave the other remaining questions to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, Yael and Daniel, for your great presentation. I can take this both as an Israeli citizen who's been using the system, that it's fun to see how the digitalization is jumping steps and the services are reachable from home. A lot of the questions that came out from your presentation were about how can government services reach resource limited setting and rural areas and areas where the internet connectivity is limited. And we're very happy that you're asking that, because this leads us to our next speaker, Kylie Telpert, who's the VP of Business Development at Entrance. This is a company with a very unique technique to connect, again, resource limited setting as well as others to cloud solutions. So Kylie, I'll invite you to open your mic and camera and share the screen. And Daniel and Yael, thank you very much. I hope we will have time for a few more questions, but you can also see them at the Q&A section and try and reply.
Great, thanks, Haget. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone, really pleased to be here. What I'll do is I'll try to talk quite briefly and show a few presentations and then really open it up and try to spend most of the time on questions and answers. So also at any point, feel free if people have questions, I'd be happy for this to be interactive. So to maybe just write the questions and feel free to jump in and stop me at any point. I'd be happy to do that.
So I'll do that. I'll advise everyone to use the Q&A section and I'll do my best to communicate.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll start by giving a short overview of who Friends is, what we do, and then how we've really tried to leverage and take what we do, what we've been doing in our work in emerging markets in the last mile, and seen how we could use that for dealing with COVID-19, and particularly in Africa and in emerging markets in general, but specifically we've been looking at Africa. So I'll start with a short overview of Friends. This has nothing to do with COVID-19, but I think, you know, from what I understand, the goal of these sessions is also to see how we can use technology, business innovation, and what, you know, people were doing before the crisis, and how you can leverage that and use that to solve challenges and to solve some of the really big challenges that we're seeing, particularly in emerging markets. So with that context, let me give you a little bit of background on Friends and what we do in general, and then from there I'll jump straight into our COVID-19 solutions. So we're a company that's set up to do what we call last mile distribution, basically reaching the small last mile retailers or outlets where there's hundreds of thousands. There's like 400 million of these small outlets globally, and that's where the average people buys their goods and services, whether it's Coca-Cola, as you can see, they're our global partner, or shampoo or soap or whatever the basics are. And as we'll discuss, this is also super important during COVID-19 because people need to be able to buy their basic necessities. So we've developed a model to help the large companies reach these small outlets, and also ensure that the small outlets and the retailers get the best prices and opportunities they can. We call it a hybrid last mile distribution network. We've got today around 20 million users on our platform. Something very important also for what I'll speak about is you don't need the internet to access it. So it's accessible through mobile, through web, through USSD. We've got 21 patents, and we're active mainly in Africa and in Southeast Asia, with global partners such as Coca-Cola, and I'll speak a little bit about the kind of things we do with Coca-Cola, with AXA, which is a large insurance company, with Microsoft. So all the solutions, particularly I'm going to show you today, are joint Microsoft and Friends solutions. We're what's called a co-sell partner. So our solutions, Microsoft actually sells Friends solutions, and we have Microsoft solutions embedded into ours. And that, on one hand, helps us really get to the scalability, but also make sure that the Microsoft solutions are adapted and developed specifically for the settings in Africa and emerging markets. So we work together with them very closely on the development side, but also on the engineering and the business side. And I'll show you how some of those solutions are relevant for today. And basically, you know, just to summarize, we work across different verticals or different kind of sectors or areas. So we do a lot of work with banks and in finance. We do work with FMCG, fast moving consumer goods. So like Coca-Cola or Unilever or Procter & Gamble are all examples of those. We work with governments. So particularly in Rwanda, and relevant for this, we have a solution where the whole country today can access any government service through our platform, and they don't need internet. So birth certificates, driver's license, national insurance, all of that they can access through our platform, no mobile data, no internet required. And basically we bring these different types of business sectors together onto one single platform, and we know how to reach those end users. Now, taking everything I've just said and applying it to the COVID-19 situation, right, when we started realizing that this was going to be a global challenge and, not just in China, what we did as a company is we started looking, okay, what's going to be needed? We very quickly saw, even in Europe, the US, very developed markets, that it was a disaster. Everyone's now speaking, it being very common to talk about flattening the curve, but when you think about it, a few months ago, no one knew what that meant. And we very quickly realized that in the settings in which we operate, this is going to be an even bigger problem, because you don't have the healthcare facilities, tight budgets, a lot of poor people. And we started thinking very early on, okay, how do we use the tools that are available and that can be accessed? And how can we take what we've already done with our technology and adapt that to these markets? So you've heard already about some of the things that they're doing in Israel, and that's great. But if most of the population doesn't have a smartphone, it's limited in what you can do with mobile applications and web-based tools. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk you through some of the things that we've developed and that we're in the process of rolling out in the different countries. And again, as I say, keeping it in mind that the environment we're working in is an environment where many, many people are not digital. So in general, before I show some examples, I like to think of our platform and what we're doing with digital tools, both sharing information and collecting information. Now that's relevant usually with large companies who want to know what's happening in their value chain, sales, promos, that sort of data, but it's also relevant for governments, because if you want to be able to respond to a crisis, you need two main things. You need to, one, be able to get information out to citizens in a way that's timely, that they can see, get the information in real time when it's relevant on devices that they can afford, that doesn't collect their money. But then you also need the ability to collect that information and take decisions on it. And I think we've seen across the globe, that was actually that's been a real challenge. Is, we've had almost all over the world these huge lockdowns because there wasn't a way to effectively, in a short time frame, identify where the outbreaks and do lockdowns only in those areas and pinpoint it. And everyone's saying now in the second wave, we might have a better ability to do that, but definitely that's still limited today. And some of the solutions we came up with were based around that, is how do we share information and then get information from citizens in Africa, in emerging markets in general. So this is a bit of that question I heard. Just to kind of explain a little bit how we work with Microsoft. So basically what we did is we took our different tools, which were mobile app, USSD, which I'm sure people are familiar with, but I'll explain that shortly. And then also like Power BI and business intelligence. So it's kind of a combination of Microsoft and Friends platforms, all of which have been adapted to work together and that we're using across our business. And we saw how can we take those tools and adapt them to COVID-19 and to the situation. Go through that quickly. And yeah, you don't need to know about the tools. I can always come back to. So just to give you a little bit of overview of, I'm sure most in Ethiopia know what USSD is, but or the techies do. But for many people in Africa, maybe less the people who aren't coming from Africa or emerging markets, the menus you see in front of you are probably pretty familiar. Now, if they're familiar, you also probably know some of the challenges. So USSD, basically how it works is you dial a short code, so *123#, and you get menus. Now, it's very, very common and used all over Africa, as you know, but there's often a lot of challenges. So for example, you might have a timeout. So you'll be in the middle of a session and then it times out, or you get a phone call and you have to start everything from the beginning. now, this is a big challenge when you're trying to do things like processes, collecting information, banking processes. And Friends has the technology to overcome a lot of these challenges. So we have 21 patents, and a lot of that is getting over some of the limitations you usually have with a simple phone where you don't have mobile data, and also connecting this all to the cloud. So there's a lot of kind of back-end functionality that we're bringing to these very simple menus. I'll give you some other examples. We have an ability to do what we call dynamic menus. So someone dials a short code, so let's say again, *123, and they can see different menus. So for example, if you have a patient or a citizen, they could see a different menu to a healthcare worker, even though they've dialed the same code, because we have the ability to show different menus. Now, someone familiar with USSD, that's like magic. You know, usually people go and they have to buy different short codes because they don't realize there's an ability to do these different dynamic menus. Then within these menus, we have different options. And I can actually, if there's time, I'll also show a live demo. I just wasn't sure about internet connectivity and what it would be like. So I'm starting with the static screens. And if we see there's not too many questions, I'll show you these live menus. So for example, here on the screen, you see self-diagnosis. So again, what did we have in mind when we came up with these solutions is, if there's a real outbreak, not everyone's going to be able to go to hospital. There just aren't enough resources to get everyone to hospital. So we need to find a way to monitor people, to get information, to give them information while keeping them at home. And that's how we built our self-diagnosis or symptoms tracker, they sometimes call it, where you've probably seen this. We're not the only people doing it, but we ask a series of questions and we collect all that data, which I'll show you how we get that to the government afterwards. And that's all stored in the system. And we have this ability to ask a lot of different dynamic questions about how the user's doing. So do you have a cough? Do you suffer from shortness of breath? And we collect all that information from them. Let's see how I move this. So the self-diagnosis, different questions. And then based on the questions, we have like a back-end algorithm that then classifies them. Are you moderate? Are you severe? What should you do? And then we give tips and information based on their responses. It's also available through mobile app. So one of the beauties of the solution is that if you have a smartphone, great, you can do it on a smartphone. You can have nice menus. We've got other menus that have graphics. But if you don't, or if you ran out, like one of the big challenges in the markets we work is, even when people do have smartphones, sometimes on Monday they have mobile data, but then by Wednesday it's run out. So that means Wednesday they can't use the system. So the beauty here is on Monday they can use the smartphone, and Wednesday they can use the USSD solution. And then if they've again got data, they're able to shift back to the mobile solution. And the other huge feature here is that it works on both. And that's actually been a really, really big selling point, both with governments and companies during this COVID-19 crisis, is governments need a way to interact very quickly, easily, share information. You know, even something as simple as do not go to medical facilities because you'll make people sick. If we have internet and updates and TV, we get access to these information. But if you don't, you rely on the mobile phone to do that. So we can give governments all these tools in order to reach their users, but they don't really want to sit on a small phone like this sending messages to millions of different users. So one of the beauties of the platform is it's completely interoperable. So a government will log into like a nice Ministry of Health web portal. We use Microsoft Teams. Some of you might be familiar with it. And they can organize and get dynamic menus and do analytics and send messages that then the end user can either get through mobile app or through the simple phone interfaces. And that really makes sure that the service is available to everyone and includes everyone in it, and no one gets left behind or misses this important information. And then the ministry can then track all of this on dynamic dashboards and Power BI. And as I said, I can show you some demos of this if there's time, but basically they can zoom in, they can see where there are different infections, where the problems are, all that information we're collecting through the simple phone interfaces every day. They are then able to put together and view that all in one app and on the dashboard. So I think that's in a nutshell kind of what we're doing and how we're leveraging our different platforms and services to do that. Maybe I'll pause here, take some questions, and then if it's of interest, I'll jump to some demos to show you as well.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. So please, I advise everyone who has a question for N-Friends to go ahead and type them. The first question we have here is, what if one diagnoses him or herself as positive in COVID-19? If you respond, how long will it take? And what if one loses network connection? So maybe you can re-explain a bit how does the system work and handle those cases?
Sure. Okay. Let me show myself as well. Hi. Great. So the first thing is, how do you respond? That's an important point to mention, is we work with governments. So it's not me that can answer that question, it will be the government that answers it. So any technology is only as good as the institution using it. So what we try doing as part of our design process is organize things knowing that everyone has very little capacity, they have very little resources. You know, every country is under pressure now, the health system with COVID-19. So there actually are some solutions, and I'll show you that we actually chose not to include in our system because we know that the resources and the capacity aren't there. You know, we have the capacity to do like contact tracing, where you can see every single place where a user's been over the last period. But we know that it's unlikely that in the context we're working, a healthcare worker is going to be able to ask every single patient to remember all the places they've been in the last 14 days. So the technology is there to do all of this, but really the response at the end of the day is going to also depend on the health care facilities, the ministries of health in each country. And obviously we work with them to make the interfaces and everything as simple as possible. That was the first question. The next one I think you said was connectivity. So that's the beauty. You don't need any mobile data. So you do need cell phone coverage. So it's magic, but it's not complete magic. So when you look at Africa, for sure, you know, when you look at most of the world has mobile network coverage, and most people have phones. They don't have smartphones necessarily, and they don't have mobile data. We don't need either of those. We just need, like, you know, when you see a little phone, one bar, if you've got one bar, you can access our system.
Okay, that's great. There was another question about languages, but I guess you also, I mean, the platform can be used in various languages depending on.
Yeah, but it actually is a relevant question, because sometimes in USSD, the things we do shouldn't be taken for granted because not everyone can do them, but you can switch languages. So everything we do in the local language, in some places where we work in multiple languages, you can have multiple languages, and you go in and you set the language that's relevant.
Excellent. And another question is, can you speak to some of the limitations of USSD in terms of using this for government services which require document sharing, etc.?
Sure. Okay. So I'll answer that question with something I used to say. We do an interpretation.
Maybe I'll stop, because there's another question here saying, what is USSD? So maybe if you can re-explain for those of us who are technologically challenged.
Okay.
It just came up, so it would be good.
So I'll start with the second question, and then we'll go to the first one. So USSD, it's basically any GSM phone, like for the past 20 years, you'll have USSD. So basically it's based on, you do need mobile coverage. So we work with the mobile operators, and it's a text-based solution. And it's used very, very prevalently, particularly in Africa, for like the most simple thing for people who aren't familiar with it is if you ever have to like load prepaid airtime usually how that works is you'll get a card with a number and you dial *130# and then you put in the number and then that adds the airtime onto your phone. So that's a very, very basic application of how to use it. It's used very often for banking in Africa, for mobile money transfers, but it's usually on one hand very commonly used, but gives people a lot of frustrations. And that's, that's part of what we're doing. Some of the things I said is timeout. That's a big issue. Is usually when you do USSD, you'll have a timeout and you have to start from the beginning. So if you're filling a survey or a bank application, or in this case, a COVID-19 survey, if you've got up to question 5 in most cases and you have a timeout, you've got to start again. So it's actually impossible almost to do full processes. With our solution, if you have a timeout, you got to question 5, or you have to run to work, or to, for some reason you have to stop, it's not a problem. You can come back tomorrow or next week or next month and you'll still be on question 5. And what we've also got is the analytics platform. So that's very unique, is we can see everything that people are doing on that platform and use it to improve the service. So if we see everyone doing the COVID-19 survey stopped on question 5, there's a good chance there's a problem with question 5. Maybe the language isn't clear, or for some reason people are not getting there. So we'll pick that up in our analytics, and then we'll go back to the field and the users and we'll say, what's the problem with question 5? How do we improve it? So there's a lot we do with also the analytics to keep improving and making the user experience as simple as possible. You can't do everything. We're still limited, and this comes to the question, to text-based. But how I started answering that question is we used to run in Rwanda an entrepreneurship program where we teach young youth how to be entrepreneurial and entrepreneurial thinking. And one of the principles of that program, which I think is also a principle of our work, is actually what we call innovation in a box. So usually when people are trying to teach you to be innovative, they say, think outside the box. And that sounds cool, but what if you do have a box? And the reality, particularly in the African context, is we have boxes, we have constraints. We don't have all the resources in the world. People have limited money, they have limited food, they have limited all sorts of things. And in this case, our limitation is the phone. They have simple mobile phones and they often don't have mobile data. And what's truly innovative is really thinking, how do I think within the box? It's very easy if you have all the money and all the resources in the world to come up with solutions. But it's when you're limited, when you don't have all the resources, that's when you really have to think innovatively. And I know there's a lot of students in the call, so that's also something I'd encourage them, is don't think I'm limited by something. Rather, you need to think like within the limitations, how can I be as creative as I can be? And I think that's really what we did with the USSD, is we said within the limitations of what we have, how can we be as creative as we can be and get as much functionality? And we've got almost all the functionality of a smartphone, but you're never going to be able to take pictures or send attachments. That said, and it's important for me to say, we don't only do USSD. I've spoken a lot about it because I think in the context we're talking about, there's a lot of people who don't have smartphones. But as I said, we totally interoperable. So we also have smartphone applications. You also have USSD. So how we usually solve a lot of these problems is we set up agent networks. So an agent will usually have a smartphone. He'll be an inference employee, and there'll be a few agents in each village or each region that will provide services to the end users. So for example, you can have, I'll give an example in banking. You might not be able to register a new bank customer without a smartphone because you need certain documentation and pictures of ID. So that will be done by the agent with a smartphone. But then all the other banking transactions, payments, loans, all of that they can do on USSD. So wherever we can, we do it on USSD, and where we can't, then you need to go to an agent to use a smartphone. So there's different ways of finding solutions within those limitations.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kelly. There are a few more technical questions that you can see in the Q&A section and maybe be able to answer on the technical level. I love the comment on innovating in a box. I think a lot of what we're trying to do here is get some inspiration from what's been done around the world and see how we can fit those solutions or those directions to the box of limitation or what's on the ground in Ethiopia, and kind of see these connections. So thank you very much for this comment and for the great presentation. We'll move on to our third speaker today, Monica Rosal-Scalillo, who's the CEO of Creators. Creators is a hub supporting government innovation, among others. And we brought Monica to speak a bit to the entrepreneurs and to the ICT professionals and to the students on the ground, and share a bit of her vast experience on how can entrepreneurs work with the government, develop digital tools, and try and work together. So Monica, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hagit. Thank you, everyone. Let me just quickly share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation. So my presentation is going to specifically target in the audience those of you who are interested in the GovTech as a potential business opportunity. Maybe you are entrepreneurs and you're exploring different options for your next business. So I hope that I will be able to answer some of your questions about whether it makes sense to go into work with the government and both local and central governments. So before I jump into the presentation, I want to say a couple of words about Creators. Just a moment. So as Hagit mentioned, we are an innovation lab based in Tel Aviv. We do all sorts of smart innovation programs for both the public sector and the corporations. So we basically work with a spectrum of different organizations. We work with multinational corporations. We work with cities around the world. We work with governments in Israel and abroad. So basically a lot of different entities. And our daily job is basically to support their innovation capabilities, also in working with in the open innovation models, which usually involves collaboration with startups. Also, a lot of times, especially when it comes to the public sector, supporting them in understanding that actually sometimes working with startups and entrepreneurs can be more beneficial than working with big tech companies. So actually the benefits of working with smart and medium entities that are sometimes more relevant for their needs, or they can actually create solutions that are relevant for their specific needs. So before I jump into the presentation, I want to share with you that we produce a lot of content. So we have our blog where we share a lot of different lessons learned from our work and tips for working together. So you can go there and check it out. If you would like to get our newsletter, we also share a lot of knowledge about what we are doing in there. We publish reports. The two last reports that we have published relate to corporate innovation. You can see one in the screen, and also in the last month we have just finished and published a Chief Digital Officer report. It's a report about digital transformation. So if you are interested in that, we would be happy to send it to you. It's basically free of charge, downloadable from our website. We share a lot of content on social media as well. And finally, we do a lot of research, and basically we share it usually through different reports that we are happily sharing with our community free of charge. In the next couple of weeks, we are actually also going to share a new report that we have just written about the GovTech programs around the world. So if you are interested in that content, we'll be happy to send you a copy. Again, everything will be downloadable from our website. And here are a couple of links. So later on, after this webinar, I will share this presentation with the organizers, and please feel free to just request it, and you'll be able to get all the links. So now let's move into the startup government collaboration. Again, this particular presentation is tackling the challenge of collaborating between startups and governments from the perspective of the entrepreneurs or wannabe entrepreneurs. So in the next 8 minutes, I will try to share with you, first of all, the potential of government. Why is it interesting, relevant for you to explore going into GovTech as your potential field of interest? Second of all, the challenges and opportunities in the sector. And finally, some tips for successful cooperation. Now, I'm not talking about specifically this challenging time of COVID-19. These tips are relevant for both today and tomorrow, the crisis time, and hopefully some sort of normalcy after that. But basically, we see that in GovTech, of course, there is no better time in trying to innovate together with the government than the time when it's actually needed to be digitalized. So it's a good opportunity as well going forward. So now, before I move into the different tips, I want to share with you two different approaches that have influence on how you actually start collaborating with the government. So the two approaches that the government has to collaborating with external solution providers is one, through call for solutions. So it's usually a procurement. Governments a lot of times, as you know, share the procurement where they say specifically what they want to order, or more new, kind of the newer way is the call for challenges. And this is something that, by the way, in Israel, it has been introduced in the last couple of years, and we have seen it over and over again also in Israel and especially in Europe these days. More and more governments are actually interested in going into the challenge-based collaboration with external providers, and this is because, as you can see, they usually provide more variety, and they kind of open our minds to what is out there, not necessarily what we thought could be relevant, but actually what could be something that we didn't think about even that could be relevant for us. So just going through a few of the basis of these approaches. So first of all, if we look at the solution base, so basically something that we usually encounter in the work with the government, both local and central, is that the specific solution is requested. Then it usually starts with some sort of procurement process, because of course it needs to be as transparent as possible. Not very startup friendly, because all the procurement processes are quite heavy for SMEs. So it's usually rather attractive for companies that have a lot of experience with that. And finally, it's a bit of a rigid approach, because of course what the government is looking for is very specified, is procured. When it comes to the challenge-based approach, it's more so first of all, the need is expressed. So we are not talking about what solution we want, but we talk about what need do we have. Usually it is a part of a GovTech program. So as I mentioned, we just mapped over 20 GovTech programs from around the world, and we write about it more in our report. If it's of any interest to you, I'll be happy to share it with you when it's ready. And it's a part of a GovTech report. It's a part of a GovTech program, usually because it is more, so to speak, it's more difficult for government to process this sort of projects without, the basis of a program, because it's usually not procurement. It's another way of dealing with this sort of solutions. So it's a bit different in this regard. And because of that, it is also more startup friendly, and it's kind of almost designed to attract small and medium businesses. And finally, it allows for more creativity and novelty, because it opens up the array of potential solutions that are accepted. So that's kind of to show that we have these two different approaches, and really sometimes the governments are specifically asking for XYZ, but other times, especially in the GovTech project context, they are actually open to more to sharing the challenge, as opposed to sharing this specific need for a specific solution. So why is GovTech interesting and relevant? So first of all, for me, working with a lot of entrepreneurs, we always try to give them the actual, real, meaningful challenge to solve. So if you want to be successful as an entrepreneur in whatever context, you need to have a challenge, a need that you know exists. And I like to call it a medicine and not a vitamin. We actually need to go into a challenge that needs to be solved, that someone really is looking for a solution. So in a way, a medicine. It doesn't necessarily be should be a nice to have, like a vitamin. So that's the first thing. GovTech actually enables entrepreneurs working with governments to solve real, tangible challenges, and there are so many in the GovTech context. Then the second one is the barrier of entry, of course, is very high. So to start working with the government, it's a bit of a pain to go through the procurement processes and all of the bureaucracy. But once you are inside, once you proved yourself and you actually started working with the government, the scaling up is easier because governments, local and central governments, are not competitive. And if you start in one sector of the government, sometimes another branch has a very similar issue. So they will be able to, collaborate, and you will also be able to ask for referrals if you are successful. Finally, GovTech is a huge potential market. And just to give you a couple of numbers, so GovTech market today is worth $400 billion, but it is estimated that by 2025 it will be worth $1 trillion. So it's actually a huge market. It's a bigger market than fintech or basically any other market. It's the biggest one in the world, and it's growing. The second thing is that governments are the largest employers, and they are the largest service providers. They also have the biggest data sources. So actually work with data in the GovTech context is something that is enormously needed, and it couldn't be more relevant today in the times of the crisis. So now going quickly to the challenges and the opportunities. I want to start with the challenges. Of course, there are many challenges in working with governments, both local governments and central governments. First of all, you need to find your right stakeholder, which we call your champion. And it's not easy because to navigate through any sort of big organizations, and this is true for both governments and corporations of any kind, any big organization is complicated in its structure. So this is the same in governments. But to take this challenge and basically turn it into your opportunity, once you find your champion, and by champion I mean someone who really wants to help you, you are in good hands. So that's the first challenge that you need to go through. The second is to basically understand that going into work with the government, you very often need to kind of treat it as a design partner for you. So you enter a new sector and you start with one organization that it becomes your partner to actually basically deliver your first product. And it will not be a ready product before you actually contact them and talk to them and understand their needs better. Which is again a challenge of convincing potential governmental organization to give you that chance. It's very challenging to get money for your efforts from the governments. Again, if it's a procurement process, you will definitely be paid, but it's going to be a long, painful process a lot of times. If it's a pilot, a lot of times governments cannot pay for that. Again, because it has not been a competitive process, so they cannot choose you to pay you. It's always a difficult piece of a puzzle to get payment from the governments. Again, if it wasn't a procurement process. Finally, navigating through bureaucracy is of course a bit difficult, and navigating through the organization's DNA, politics. Every big organization has its own, politics and people who are responsible for one thing and not the other. So all of that is also true for the government organizations. So these are the challenges, but let's go into the opportunities next. There are also a lot of opportunities in this sector. The first is that, as I mentioned before, because it is such a difficult market to get into, once you are inside, you have this amazing capability over your competition to actually start scaling and growing. And it's also giving you access to a very big market, as mentioned before. Second of all, governments crave innovation and startups, and it couldn't be more true today. Even before, the COVID-19 outbreak, we saw that for the last couple of years, all around the world, there are more and more government officials, city officials who are ready for innovation, and they are not afraid of any innovation anymore. So there is a lot of openness to working with innovative startups. Finally, GovTech programs make it easier to start. So whenever there is a GovTech program, it really gives an opportunity for entrepreneurs to start easier than if there is no one. VCs are increasingly interested in investing in GovTech startups. This is also something that we see a lot of change right now during the COVID-19 outbreak. The VCs understand how much potential does this sector have. And finally, this pandemic unleashed a lot of new opportunities and needs as well. So there is, again, a lot of opportunities, especially the post-COVID world, when it comes to efficiency, when it comes to digitalizing services, when it comes to digitalizing operations, processes inside, when it comes to work from home. There is a full new world of opportunities that are being searched by the governments as well. So I want to leave you with a couple of tips for successful collaboration. First of all, whenever you can, try to work in the scope of the GovTech program. And by the GovTech program, I mean program that is designed by the government or with the government to attract startups to work together. They usually have great resources and great potential to actually, show, basically have all the challenges removed for you because there is someone working for you there. The second thing is that it's always good to do your research before you start working with any sort of government organization. If they already worked with startups before, it's good to ask other startups about tips. That's good for any sort of collaboration. Third of all, choose smaller projects and prove yourself first. So the government, a lot of times in the GovTech projects, we deal with these huge programs, huge projects, this transformational or digitalization projects that are almost endless. I always try to convince both parties to start small first, because it's still too difficult for, I think, for inexperienced organizations, and governments are not so experienced yet when it comes to working in open innovation models with other external parties, to do it quickly and seamlessly together. Then create clear KPIs and a written work plan. Now, written is a key word here. A lot of times during the program, any sort of project, KPIs, so key performance indicators, the measurements, how we are going to measure the success of our project may change. But if we have it written down, we can always change it. We can always, basically update it based on any development. But we have it written down, and we know who's doing what. What should we do? What should we expect? It's very important to actually have some sort of plan to work with.
Monica, I'm sorry to disturb, but we need to start wrapping up. So if you can go through the next points quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, search for committed partners. Committed partners inside of the government. Not everyone is interested to working with you. So you need to search again for this champion that is going to help you with that. Create your own project team inside of the public sector. And by that, I mean preferably have one senior official, one subject matter expert that is your project manager. And it's good to have a finance director or some finance person on this team that you work with. Consider working for free if you want to have a long-term perspective of working in GovTech. Again, a lot of times governments cannot always start a pilot process, for example, by paying you. So it's something to consider. And last but not least, try to create a use case driven solutions as opposed to trends. So actually you want to, again, touch on something that is a real pain for the government. That's it.
Monica, thank you very, very much for this wonderful presentation with lots of useful insights and advice for the entrepreneurs in the crowd. And I also think for the government official in the crowd on how to collaborate and work together. I believe you addressed a lot of the questions that came in the Q&A section about the collaboration between private sector players and especially startups to the government work. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask Yael to answer these two more questions that repeatedly came in the chat and that we would love to hear your feedback on. One question was about the continuity of those services post-corona times. I mean, did you establish all the services that are going to be used for now a few months and disappear or be, I mean, would we go back? In terms of the infrastructure you set in place. And the second question was about government employees working remotely. There's a concern which is constantly being raised about, you know, the line of efficient work or how can you monitor that? And if you have a few insights on that briefly from your experience, we would love to hear, just as a closing remark.
Okay. So about the first question, the infrastructures were built before. You can't build infrastructure within 2 weeks. We built services above already built infrastructures. These services, sometimes they are especially for the Corona time, and sometimes we will benefit from them for good. So it depends. Yes, we started to build new infrastructures like video conference infrastructure and others, but it takes time. It will take some months to build new infrastructure for government. It's not short-term thing. About the second question, it's a thing that hurt also in Israel for some managers. You have to change your mindset. When we started to work as a team from home, we changed the way we manage. For example, every day, every morning, we have a meeting with all the friends in our team, and every one of them is telling the others what is going to do in this day. And what we are looking is not how much time he worked at home. I don't care, really, I don't care if it's 2 hours or 9 hours. If he did what he needed to do, but if he did, he bring the work, he did the mission. So why should I care if he works 2 hours or 5 hours or 9 hours? But it's really hard to managers to do this switch. Okay, and it's also you need to change some of the ways of the management to be more close. Every day, phones, Zoom meetings, and not in the way of sitting and looking what everyone doing every time, but because you don't see them in real life, you have to make more contact. I think it works better for both sides. Even to management is getting better, from my opinion, it's getting better if you change to more agile-like management. And also the workers have, I think, more attention to what they are doing, not how many times they are being in the office. That's it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think this insight about being results-based, in managing your employees rather than hour tracking is definitely true. Also, I mean, beyond the government sector, to everyone who's working remotely. I'm sorry that we have to wrap up. There were a few questions that came up regarding the education sector and how did the education sector dealt with the lockdown and with the shutdown of schools. Unfortunately, this was not something that we were able to cover today. We in the Pears program, we will look into this issue together with UNDP and see if there is any advice or information that we can share to also approach these questions. As well as any other question that came up and you were not able to get an answer to, please contact myself, Hagit, and Yarden on email. Our emails were just posted in the chat box by Yarden. And we'll be happy to follow up on any issue that was not covered, to refer to any technical issue, and also to try and see if there's other issues we might be able to address in future webinars. I'd like to thank the speakers that joined us today, Yael and Daniel from the ICT Authority, presenting how the Israeli government had used the digital tools it has, as well as developed new tools during this crisis. I'd like to thank again Kylie Telpert, the VP of Business Development in Inference, for presenting One Tech and One Startup, which is a platform that company that is used to allow government services in resource limited setting and in areas where there's low connectivity. And I'd also like to thank Monica from Creators, who spoke a bit about this world of government technology and shared some valuable advice and inputs for entrepreneurs who wants to engage in this sector, as well as governments looking to collaborate. I'll say that we have another webinar, the third in this series, coming up next week, exactly at the same time. Next week, we will look at social and economical challenges, and we'll look at how can open source platforms be used to address these challenges. So we have two fascinating speakers presenting open source tools. There was also a question in the chat box about open source tools. So we will address this in depth next week, and would love it if you will join us. Anyone who has questions, both for next week and about everything that we discussed today, please feel free to contact us. I'd like to thank again UNDP Acceleration Lab and specifically Udasa for the hospitality and for putting this together, and of course the Israeli Embassy in Addis Ababa for creating the connection and inviting us in Tel Aviv to get in touch with you all over Ethiopia and think of innovative ways to work together. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon. We hope to see you again next week.